pleasure to be here. I first want to thank Jake Darwin Hamblin. Perfect name, right, for a historian of science. I want to thank all of you at OSU for inviting me. It's my first time in Oregon. And I also want you to know that it is an honor, really, to be asked to participate in OSU's celebration of the life and career of Linus Pauling. Go Beavers. It is my responsibility tonight to discuss someone who shared Dr. Pauling's vision of a world free of nuclear tests, though, as you will see, this man did not share Dr. Pauling's tactics. On September 11th, 1963, as he was arguing for a limited nuclear test ban with the Soviet Union, John F. Kennedy issued a public letter reaffirming his commitment to the Cold War. Even 50 years later, two of its statements jump out in stark contrast to the spirit of what is remembered today as Kennedy's effort at a détente with the Soviet Union. Quote, "Underground nuclear testing, which is permitted under the treaty, will be vigorously and diligently carried forward." And, quote, "I am glad to emphasize again that the treaty in no way limits the authority of the Commander-in-Chief to use nuclear weapons for the defense of the United States and its allies." A commitment to vigorous underground testing to build more nukes, and glad that he can use nuclear weapons? Confused? Well, in part, Kennedy had a problem with Congress. Boy, doesn't that sound familiar? The White House didn't even draft this letter. It was drafted by the Republican leadership. But blaming congressional partisanship does not even come close to explaining the dynamic of that time. It may be useful to discuss the dynamic of a more recent time, but it doesn't actually help you understand what was going on in 1963. Because the GOP drafted this letter for Kennedy to use to sway votes, not to block his achievement. The GOP leadership wanted the president to get his treaty. You see, the greatest opposition to Kennedy's efforts at a limited détente with Moscow came from within his own party. These opponents were Southern Democrats. And other opponents, thank you, were in the executive branch itself and the United States military. Even more striking than the tension between the words in this statement and the president's commitment to a test ban treaty is the many contradictions hidden among the record of his actions in the last months of his life. Over the course of less than 36 hours in June of 1963, John F. Kennedy gave two eloquent speeches that set a new tone, not just for his administration, but for American leadership in the 1960s. The first was on June 10th and took place at American University. The American University speech set out a new philosophy for dealing with the Soviets while calling on Moscow to embrace a test ban treaty. The second, which came the very next evening, June 11th, was a speech on civil rights that signaled the start of the Second Reconstruction, calling civil rights a national moral cause and announcing the president's commitment to passing audacious civil rights legislation in his first term. A week later, Kennedy would send an ambitious bill to Congress, a civil rights bill, and a few weeks after that would reach an agreement to end all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in the water, and outer space. In the past few months, a number of books have come out lauding these achievements, and they will be heralded even more as we approach the 50th anniversary of Dallas next month. Yet, in the 5 months between those two speeches in June of 1963 and his death in November of 63, John F. Kennedy would also approve covert action to overturn 5 governments in Haiti, Cuba, British Guiana, Italy, and Vietnam. A record for a president in the Cold War. He, meanwhile, would turn a blind eye to military coups in Ecuador and the Dominican Republic. 2 of these decisions stand out for their long-term consequences. The overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of South Vietnam, would initiate a period of instability in that country that would result in a deepening of the United States military commitment in Vietnam under Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson. And Kennedy's decisions regarding Cuba would involve a secret relationship with the brutal Somoza family in Nicaragua, which would plague the United States through the dirty wars in Central America of the 1980s. You, I believe, will hear less about that in the coming weeks. But those decisions are also part of Kennedy's complex legacy. Tonight, I will try to explain how this one man could have taken risks for peace at home and abroad while accelerating the Cold War and the use of violence. Who was JFK? The John F. Kennedy I will talk about is surprisingly not well known. The end of the Cold War and the opening of records of the Soviet Union revealed the weakness of the Soviet Empire, revealed how much of Soviet aggressiveness, especially after the death of Stalin, was pure bluff. It also revealed how little the Soviets understood about us, despite their many ideological allies in the West. And by that I mean spies. But the opening of the records and the willingness of Soviet participants to talk also told us about ourselves. And about no president did we learn more from the opening of Soviet records, I would argue, than John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Starting in May of 1961 and lasting through the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy carried on secret talks with the Soviets, usually through his brother, the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. These talks encompassed all elements of the Soviet-American relationship, except for Berlin, which Kennedy discussed with Khrushchev via a secret correspondence. These talks with Bobby were the most secret initiatives undertaken by John F. Kennedy. Initially, only RFK and the President knew about them. The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, the National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and the chief criminologists in the United States government not only were cut out of the details, but did not know that these discussions existed. Bobby would meet secretly with a Soviet spy from the military service, the GRU, in the Attorney General's private office and talk through the spy with Khrushchev on behalf of his brother, the President of the United States. In 1995, a year before his death, I translated and shared the Soviet record of these conversations with McGeorge Bundy, who had been President Kennedy's national security advisor. Bundy had never seen them before, but he did not contest their authenticity. The brothers, he told me, had non-shareables between them, things that only the brothers could know and no one else in the U.S. government was allowed to know. U.S. policy, believe it or not, towards the Soviet Union, especially in the early months of Kennedy's administration, was in that category, something that only the brothers could know and not the rest of the United States government. Astounding. And we wouldn't have known about this were it not for the Soviet record. Why, you might ask, was there all this secrecy? Why did John Kennedy think that he had to conduct policy with Moscow using only his brother, the Attorney General? The answer also lies, in part, in the Soviet record. Soon after he took office, President Kennedy's goal was the same as that of Linus Pauling. It was a comprehensive test ban, a complete cessation of all nuclear testing, not simply one limited to the air, the sea, and space. A total ban on all nuclear testing. The implications of this goal, which, by the way, we still have not achieved this many years later, were absolutely breathtaking in 1961. When Kennedy decides that it should be the policy of this country to end all nuclear testing, he does not yet know that the United States is ahead of the Soviet Union in numbers of nuclear missiles. He is not trying to freeze an American advantage. He makes his first set of secret offers via Bobby to the Kremlin in May of 1961, when all he knows from U.S. intelligence is that the United States is not behind the Soviets. He is thinking that the two sides are equal, and that's a good time to freeze the nuclear competition. He is not going to know that the United States is way ahead of the Soviets until September of 61, months later, when the first CIA spy satellite finally successfully orbits the United States and the globe and collects photographs of what was thought to be Soviet missile areas. And when that happens, U.S. intelligence assessments about Soviet military power change dramatically. Up to that point, the U.S. Air Force was absolutely convinced the Soviets had hundreds of missiles. It turned out they had 6. That's a little off, isn't it? But JFK has already sent word to the Soviets he wants to freeze the nuclear race when he thinks we're equal. RFK tells the Soviets, and decades later the documents tell us why the president proceeded in such a secret manner. I mean, it's one thing to keep a secret from the American people. It's another thing to keep a secret from the rest of your government, and even something else to keep it secret from the press. Kennedy managed to do all of that. The reason Kennedy had to make it secret was he needed the Soviets to propose a new verification program. Bear with me. I'm going to take you through the weeds, but you need to. You'll see why. The Eisenhower administration and the Soviets, in their negotiations on a test ban, were stuck on how many on-site inspections the treaty would allow. You see, on-site inspections were important because the Soviet Union was a geologist's dream. Every year there were many seismic activities recorded. And it was important as a way of ensuring confidence that the Soviets were not violating a treaty, that the United States could be in a position to investigate suspicious seismic events to be sure that they were not actually proof of an underground nuclear test. Now, the Soviets, who were paranoid on the best of days, wanted to permit 3 of these investigations per year. In other words, the United States could, on 3 occasions, say, we want to come and investigate that. The Soviets said 3 is fine. The official American public position was 20. On behalf of his brother, Robert Kennedy told the Soviets that the United States would accept 10. Now, nobody in the U.S. government knew that Kennedy was giving away the negotiating strategy. But he did. He said, let me tell you, we'll accept 10. But you've got to come to me first. You've got to make the first offer. The only way I can sell this to the Senate is that if I made you move closer to ours, and then we'll have a compromise. Can you believe it? Imagine that. The U.S. president was telling the Soviets, at the height of the Cold War, how to help him negotiate a successful treaty in the United States Senate. Well, imagine if we learned that President Obama was secretly negotiating with Tehran a change in the U.S. position towards the Iranian nuclear program so that he could sell it to the Senate. The consequence of inadvertent leaking of Kennedy's secret diplomacy, I believe, would have killed any chance of any arms control agreement with the Soviets, let alone a partial test ban. And Kennedy knew this. Okay, so did we get a partial test ban in 1960? Did we get a comprehensive test ban in 1961? No, we didn't. Why? It wasn't our fault. The Soviets balked. Khrushchev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, he was the first secretary, he balked. Instead of seeking a détente, he went to Vienna to meet with Kennedy in their only summit. And he went there with the intention of scaring Kennedy into giving ground on a new status for West Berlin. The Soviets were having empire management problems. West Berlin was an open border. The border between West Berlin and East Berlin was open. It was one of the outcomes of World War II. The 4 occupying powers, actually the 3 occupying powers in France, they threw France in to make de Gaulle feel better. They divided up Berlin. The East Berlin was the Soviet occupation zone. But by rights, all of the occupying powers were allowed to move around the city. Well, not only were the occupying powers allowed to move around the city, but East Germans were allowed to move around the city, and a lot of them were using West Berlin to get the hell out of it. And so there was a drain of professionals from East Germany that was really causing a crisis there. The Soviets wanted to find a way to stop that, and they wanted a new status for West Berlin. So Khrushchev wanted to threaten Kennedy with war, or at least threaten him with an ultimatum to get him to negotiate a new status for West Berlin. He was not interested in a comprehensive test ban at that point. So the result of this summit was not a comprehensive test ban, but what we now know as the Berlin Crisis of 1961. Khrushchev also toyed with Kennedy by unleashing a powerful set of nuclear tests in 1961, in the fall of 61, breaking the informal moratorium that the two sides had been observing since 1958. He did that when he didn't get the deal from Kennedy he wanted on Berlin. So what happens to Kennedy? He secretly offered this proposal to the Soviets. The Soviets, in turn, basically give him the finger, and you have a Berlin crisis. A lot of people are putting pressure on Kennedy saying, you should test too. Soviets have just tested. We're going to fall behind. At home, Kennedy faced enormous pressure to resume testing. But as he told his aide and unofficial historian Arthur Schlesinger in late 1961, personally, I hate the idea of resuming resuming atmospheric tests. Scientists had found elements of strontium-90, a radioactive element, in milk. And there was some concern that we were poisoning our atmosphere. Indeed, we were, through these atmospheric tests. Kennedy had no desire to further the poisoning of the atmosphere. He wanted to end all these tests. So what does he do? The Soviets have started up tests. There's pressure on Kennedy to resume them. He uses Bobby again. He sends Bobby to the Soviets and says, look, I'm going to announce that we're going to have testing again. I have no choice. I do not wish to do this. I'll make you a deal. You agree to a limited test ban, I'll cancel the tests. All I need to know is you're going to agree. Bobby made this offer to the Soviets in April of 1962 on behalf of his brother. Well, the Soviets say no to him again. Soviets are not interested in a test ban at all. They see the test ban as something the president wants, and they're going to give it to him when the United States does what they want the United States to do. The Soviets want a deal on Berlin. Can you imagine if the U.S. military, U.S. nuclear laboratories, and elements in state and the CIA and Congress learned that the president, through his brother, the Attorney General, had offered the Soviets to end the nuclear testing that everybody said was necessary if he got a partial test ban? Kennedy would have been impeached. But he felt he had to do it for his understanding of peace. It's a remarkable story. It was a remarkable risk-taking on behalf of the White House. We know what kind of a risk this was, because in the State of the Union address of 1962, Kennedy's people had wanted to put a sentence in there saying, basically, if the Soviets would agree to a partial test ban, we might not have to go ahead with testing at all. But the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, were against this. And so they pulled the sentence. So when President Kennedy couldn't get his own cabinet to support him, he did it secretly, through his brother Bobby. But Khrushchev wasn't interested. What he wanted was a new world order, and so what he did, of course, is put missiles in Cuba. Why did Kennedy want to take such a political risk? Why did he want a comprehensive test ban? We might, you have here the world's best collection to figure out Linus Pauling and why he wanted a comprehensive test ban, and I encourage you to do that. Why did John Kennedy want a comprehensive test ban? Soviet records can take us only so far in answering that question, but fortunately some new and old materials can take us the rest of the way. Last year, the John F. Kennedy Library declassified the last batch of the Kennedy tapes. In the summer of 1962, at the urging of his brother, it was Bobby's idea actually, John F. Kennedy installed a taping system in the Cabinet Room, the Oval Office, and on a few of his telephones. Unlike Richard Nixon, Kennedy controlled the use of his own system. Richard Nixon was a technophobe. And he was so clumsy that they felt that he would never be able to turn the system on. So the way the Nixon system worked was that every president has a locator. I'm sure it's very, very sophisticated now. But in that era, it was just on his belt. So whatever room he moved in, the Secret Service knew where he was at all times, and they had a little sort of diagram downstairs, the basement. And whenever the president moved into a room with a taping system, the power went on, the system. And so every sound is recorded. It's not a voice-activated system, it's a sound-activated system. I will tell you that the National Archives has protected you from having to hear some of the things that you would have heard because the door to the bathroom was opened occasionally. But the point here is that Nixon's system, he didn't control. Kennedy had a button that he pressed, and he was his own historian. He decided what he wanted us to hear. The problem is the button didn't have a light attached to it. So he didn't know sometimes if he turned it on or turned it off. So on the tape, you can occasionally hear him say his secretary was Evelyn Lincoln. Mrs. Lincoln, is it on? Is it on? Well, of course it was on, because he knows. And sometimes, he'll have a meeting with a person and he will obviously tape the wrong part. He meets with the Belgian foreign minister, and the Belgian foreign minister is working on Congo, which is a big deal for Kennedy. But their meeting also involves discussing agricultural subsidies. Well, he got the agricultural subsidy part of the meeting, which is now preserved forever, but the Congo part is lost to history. He just pressed the button at the wrong time. Anyway, JFK makes clear in many conversations that he does not believe that the Soviets constitute a military threat to the United States. Let me repeat that. He doesn't believe that the Soviet Union constitutes a military threat to the United States or its allies. Flying completely in the face of the conventional wisdom of the Cold War, he tells advisors again and again that he does not fear or expect a Soviet attack on Western Europe. He says it actually straightforward. He says the Cold War in Europe is over. What he feared was the revolutionary situation in the developing world, where the West, saddled down with its imperial legacies, was having a hard time competing with Moscow and Beijing's allies. Given that assessment of the world situation, arms control with the Soviet Union was not a risky proposition. It was a prudent one. Kennedy thought that only miscalculation could bring the superpowers to nuclear war. He wanted to reduce the danger of Armageddon. Now, Kennedy did not keep all of his Cold War skepticism close to his heart. He liked to talk to journalists. At one point in his life, Kennedy thought he might even become a journalist. He knew how to talk to them. He respected them. This is a nuclear age presidency. Kennedy stressed to the great biographer William Manchester, who was actually his first presidential biographer. There is no valid comparison in the past. Kennedy explained that it was the fact that the Soviets could use nuclear weapons against the United States homeland that made the difference. It's much different than Truman's era, certainly than Roosevelt's. In Truman's era, we had the bomb. It wasn't until the last 2 years of Eisenhower's second term that the balance shifted. This is something every president from now on must face. What he meant was that since Sputnik, when the Soviets shocked everyone, including themselves, by being the first to lob a shiny object into space, the oceans no longer protected our continent from mortal danger. Now, Kennedy was no pacifist. Just because he wanted to reduce the chances of a big war, of the end of times, if you will, this did not mean that he eschewed all violence. When I was a graduate student in the late 80s and early 90s, political scientists, I'm a historian, but I like political scientists, were enamored of Michael W. Doyle's argument that democracies do not fight each other, and therefore the path to world peace lay in creating as many democracies as possible. The story of the Kennedy era is a reminder that the competition for power that fuels democracies can itself encourage violence. Kennedy believed there were limits on what a president could do publicly to end the tension with the Soviets and survive politically. In short, the U.S. political system rewarded people who waved the flag and spoke in absolutes. He understood his secret diplomacy was necessary because he did not believe it was possible politically in Cold War America to tell the Congress or the American people how committed he was to a comprehensive defense ban or to concessions regarding West Berlin or even a neutral Laos in Southeast Asia. Kennedy inherited from Truman and Eisenhower a bipartisan commitment to bear any burden and pay any price for the defense of liberty. Yes, those are Kennedy's words, but he was only articulating U.S. practice. The country that had fought for and lost men over the liberty of Koreans, a people that the United States had hardly had any contact with before World War II. Meanwhile, the United States spent millions propping up the economies of rivals in Western Europe and countries that few Americans could have found on the map in the Balkans. The United States had also overthrown governments in Guatemala and Iran and tried and failed to do the same in Indonesia. If he told Americans that actually the Soviets are not that much of a threat, how long would it take for a congressman to criticize him for not loving his own country? It has been the same problem that all presidents, for example, have had since 9/11 regarding the terrorist threat as it declined. They can't fully admit it because at any point they could be attacked for not doing enough for national security. That is the problem of living in a time of absolutes. Equally part of the American political imagination in the Cold War was that the United States had the power to determine whether countries were lost to communism. A generation of American leaders, JFK among them, blamed the Truman administration for losing China, as if the United States could determine the fate of several 100 million people locked in a civil war. Over a half century later, the fact that these were illusions is easy to understand. But back then, they were not only not considered illusions, they had the power of political axioms. President Kennedy didn't believe them. We know this. We have him on tape saying it. But if he wanted to be an effective legislator in his first term and be reelected to a second, he could not let the American public or Congress know how out of step he was with Cold War orthodoxy. Thus, the use of his brother Bobby. And the surprise in the Kremlin, frankly, when these secret offers kept coming their way. Kennedy was a very smart political analyst. Although he was confident of his own abilities, he had a pessimistic view of American politics. In February of 1962, he also told he talked to William Manchester about the nature of power in the United States. Manchester said, "Do you have any sense of compassion for the Republicans?" He said, "No." He said, "A shift of a few votes in 1960 and they'd be on top. And they'll take any issue, Laos, South Vietnam," this is in 1962 he says this, "and they'll ride it to the top." When Manchester tried to argue that the Depression had made the Democratic Party the most powerful of the country's two main parties, Kennedy disagreed. He said that the GOP dominated the American political landscape, and the only reason Democrats can compete was the Solid South. And he thought he might lose the Solid South. The Democratic Party in that era was really two parties. In a sense, we've seen a flip-flop in our government, in our history. The Republican Party is now two parties. The Democratic Party was two parties. It was a northern party, northern progressive, industrial, urban-based party with some Midwestern support, and a Solid South committed to a version of apartheid. It's a different party. And the challenge for a victorious president was to link both of these elements of the party. And Kennedy was too much of a political realist to believe that he could always do it. And he was not convinced that his reelection was a lock. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which by all rights was a success for Kennedy, did not change his basic insecurity about his political future. Again, we know this from the tapes. And his decision to come out of the closet on what he actually thought of the Soviets finally in 1963 in the American University speech, and his reluctant support for ambitious civil rights legislation made him even more concerned. He thought, I am even more vulnerable. It's going to make me even less likely to be reelected. Ever the pragmatist, Kennedy decided in the summer of '63 that he was going to have to take chances on policies that were likely to cost political capital. And if he did that, he would have to take other decisions to shore up his support in Cold War America. In particular, if he wanted to be reelected, he needed to shore up his appeal among American hawks to make up for the segregationists he would lose on account of his new civil rights policies. This is why, the same summer that he gave the civil rights and American University speeches, he approves covert action to intervene in the domestic politics of 4 countries, Cuba, Haiti, Italy, and Vietnam, and 1 territory, British Guiana. Quote, "The tough decisions have to be made this year," Kennedy said, in the context of foreign economic policy, but the sentiment governed all of his decisions, those final fatal months of his presidency and of his life. He did not make these decisions easily. He agonized over them, but he made them nonetheless. Kennedy believed that the ends, a Civil Rights Act, a détente with the Soviets, and his own re-election, justified the means. The United States government made it possible for the Nicaraguans to train Cuban exiles to launch terrorist attacks against Cuban targets on the island. Why did they do this? Our government did it because Cuban emigres had been launching sabotage operations from American soil. One of these attacks was on a Soviet vessel. It wasn't good for Nick Kennedy, who was trying to have better relations with the Soviets, for some of these were American citizens, to be launching attacks on Soviet merchant ships from Florida. The United States government put a stop to those. Southern Democrats complained. Why are you preventing Cubans from liberating their country? So Kennedy had to find a way to continue the sabotage attacks in a way that would be deniable for the U.S. government. So he went to a country with a dictatorship and asked them to train these people so that these could come from Nicaragua, even though the United States is paying for them, and the CIA was organizing them. But the Kennedy administration could tell the Soviets, we didn't do it. This Kennedy felt he had to do to retain the support of Southern Democrats. Kennedy was informed of each of these attacks before and after they occurred. And the United States government's official position was to deny any involvement when the people of the United Nations complained. But Kennedy felt he had to do it for his larger objectives. Over the summer of 1963, the White House sent the same kinds of instructions to the Haitian generals training in the Dominican Republic as it did to the Vietnamese generals preparing to overthrow President Diem. In both cases, the United States position was to shepherd in a government that would be more likely to protect the country from communist subversion. Kennedy preferred legitimate governments and really did have a distaste for military juntas. But even stronger was his concern about anarchy, or what we might call these days failed states. He was convinced that he would be criticized in the election year of 1964 for any country that appeared to be either now communist or on the verge of becoming communist. Kennedy made clear to his staff and to the British that he could not be re-elected if there was another Cuba. And indeed, it would be better if there was no Cuba at all. Kennedy asked, for example, London to freeze the independence movement in British Guiana, which is on the top of South America, and he wanted the British to take direct control of the colony again to ensure that a Marxist did not take over in the American election year of 1964. Arthur Schlesinger, who was more critical of Kennedy in life than in death, wrote in the first year of the administration, quote, in his unpublished diary, "We have lacked audacity as a government. JFK's personal style is superb, but he is repeatedly constrained by an over-vivid sense of political reality." That over-vivid sense of political reality never left Kennedy. This fine and intelligent man, who shaped a book called Profiles in Courage, did not always have the courage of his convictions. A vivid sense of political reality was what drove the secrecy and political expediency that defined the inner history of the Kennedy administration. I ask you, was this a mark of savvy leadership or weakness? To achieve real progress in arms control and in civil rights, Kennedy made hard decisions to deny his political opponents issues in the election year that he never got to fight. He felt he had to overthrow governments that might experience a pro-Soviet or pro-Castro revolution in the Third World. He felt he had to get rid of Castro, lest Republicans and Southern Democrats criticize him for being weak on Cuba. Do the ends justify these means? Among the tragedies of the Kennedy presidency is that he dies just after taking decisions for political expediency, but before he could establish the forms of peace that he envisioned at home and abroad, and that we know he talked to the Soviets about secretly through his brother Bobby. Before we are quick to judge Kennedy, then, for the immorality of his taste for political expediency, indeed for being an ambitious politician, let us be as clear-eyed in examining ourselves. Kennedy was flawed, but to be fair, so were we. Kennedy understood gray areas, but felt that he led a people who believed in absolutes, or at least had been misled for 15 years to believe in absolutes. And he wasn't wrong. The Cold War was often described in absolutes. And yet Kennedy understood that our safety required leaving those absolutes behind. I ask you, are we not again living in a time where people speak in absolutes and make pragmatism difficult? Do we let our leaders tell us that there are problems to which there are no solutions? Do we admire leaders that come clean in that way? Do we admire leaders who tell us that there will always be a risk of terrorism as long as we're the most powerful country and richest country in the world? Do we let leaders tell us that there is no such thing as a perfect market and that all free countries are actually not free? Do we really want to hear that from them? We can debate whether John F. Kennedy should have started the process earlier. We can debate whether he should have used the presidency as, in Theodore Roosevelt's term, a bully pulpit to educate and inform as well as to reassure. But don't we say that of all of our pragmatic presidents? Kennedy at least finally started telling people what he actually thought of the Soviet menace and the need to take risks for peace in the summer of 1963. At least he was able to do that. Sadly, as we all know, his road ended only a matter of weeks later in Dallas. The rest of the journey would be up to us and the presidents who followed him. Thank you very much.